Okay, my goodness. So today we are going to go through the 50 books that I read in 2022. I have them all piled in front of me right now, and I can already tell that compared to last year, there are a lot more physical books that I read, which is a good sign because I'm trying to get through my physical TBR. The problem is I bought just as many books as I read last year, but we're going to ignore that and pretend that I made progress. Getting right into it, I actually started with a nonfiction book called Take Back Your Time. The problem I have with a lot of nonfiction books, it feels like they could have summarized it a lot faster, but they had to drag it out into a book. After probably 7 or 8 chapters, this felt like that. I gave it 4 stars. Overall, really good. Very practical advice in that. I followed that up with something wholly different called the Four Horsemen series. I was on the 3rd book, which is called War. I only gave War 3 stars, but the series overall is probably a 4.5. As far as dark romance goes, those can be really cheesy and not well written, and these I thought were really well written. The books that I read next are called A Thousand Pieces of You by Claudia Gray. I will admit, I bought them because of the covers. Look at these covers. I've never in my life, I still can't get over these covers. It's just an aesthetic. As far as YA goes, it was so well written and the characters were so mature for their age, and the mix of sci-fi and fantasy and romance, and literally it's got everything. She essentially has a device where she can travel through universes that her father invented, but then in the first book her father is murdered and she has to chase after the guy who murdered him through the different dimensions. It's a cool concept in and of itself, but then there's so much more going on that you don't find out until the 2nd and then the 3rd book. It just gets better and better. I would reread it if I had the time. I don't know. I might reread it anyways. I'm a mood reader, so who knows if I'll ever catch up on my physical TBR. While I was reading those, I was also reading another book solely because of the guy who voices it. It's called Games We Play. Gave that book 4 out of 5 stars. I redacted that rating because I found out a lot about the author essentially stealing pretty much everything that she writes. There's a lot when you go down that pathway with that author. There's a lot. So now I feel bad for having paid for that book. I listened to the audiobook because I had Audible as well. So I didn't pay for either, but I supported whatever. It was an okay read. I followed that up with a reread from my childhood called Love and Other Foreign Words. This girl is literally 16-year-old me. I can tell reading it now that it's a YA book, but 16-year-old me really needed this book and just needed the assurance that there are other nerds and everything will be fine. This main character just really felt like a warm hug during that time. I still gave this book 5 stars, even though reading it as an adult, I can tell it's a little immature. But as a teen, I could not have lived without it. While I was reading that one, I was also reading the last 2 books in the Four Horsemen, Famine and Death. Famine I gave 3 stars. I wasn't a really big fan of him, but Death I gave 4. The personification of death in that book is it's so hot, and I'm not even ashamed to say it. The writing is really good too, so I'm willing to out myself here. Huge switch. Once again, this is just me being a mood reader and switching up my genres drastically when I get bored of one. This one is called Redeeming Love by Francine Rivers. It is a Christian romance book. Historically, have not had good experiences with Christian romance. It's kind of comes off cheesy. This one was completely different though. I gave this one 4.5 stars. It was spiritually wrecking me while at the same time had the most beautiful and heartbreaking but also redemptive romance. I don't even know how to describe this book. I think I need to read it again to really soak it in because I came in with such low expectations and I just did not expect what I got. Could not recommend this book enough for anyone. You don't have to be a Christian to read it. Anybody. It's so beautiful in how it describes their love story. Definitely some trigger warnings for that one though. Actually, for any romance book that I read this year, there might be some trigger warnings. Followed that book up with a book called The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. This is a debut author. I got it from Book of the Month. It's probably my favorite debut author of the year. This book was so adorable. I put so many tabs in it. Cutest little romance, not super deep, like the fantasy romances where everybody's life is on the line. My cat is knocking things over. But still precious and adorable, and I would reread. I gave it 4 stars. I hopped back into nonfiction after that for a bit, and I read Business Boutique by Christy Wright. It was another book by the author of Take Back Your Time that I read at the beginning of the year. Not as good as her second book. I gave it 3.5 stars. And then I read From Paycheck to Purpose by Ken Coleman. Fantastic book as far as like practical steps in each stage of your career, even after you've found your dream job, ways to just combat creative burnout, all kinds of cool practical steps in there. So I gave it 5 stars, which is unusual for me when it's a nonfiction book. I jumped back into fiction after that and read Verity by Colleen Hoover. This is my first Colleen Hoover book. Probably should have started with one of her more traditional books, but I heard that this one was creepy and psychological thriller, and I immediately was hooked. I gave it 5 stars initially. I think I would redact a little bit of that now, probably 4.5, only because it's not the greatest book I've ever read, but it still kept me on my toes, and the ending was wild. So maybe I'll keep the 5 stars. I don't know. I do need to eventually read a Colleen Hoover book that is her normal style, which is her romance books, but I have yet to do that. I was also listening to audiobooks of Priest. They are read by this guy whose name is Jacob Morgan, who has the greatest audiobook voice of a male ever. I mostly read them just for the calmness of his voice. These have pretty dark romance themes in them, which I also enjoy, but his voice reading them just makes it a level higher. Listened to Priest once, and then I listened to Sinner, which is the sequel of Priest, twice before I put anything else on my Audible. Priest I gave 4 stars. Sinner I gave 5 stars. This is where it gets complicated when I'm reading physical books, audiobooks, and Kindle Unlimited books at the same time, because also while I was listening to these on audiobook, I was reading a book called Bound by Honor. It is a dark romance. Again, you can see a theme here. This girl is forced to be engaged to the son of a mafia boss. Pretty cheesy, I know, but it ended up being like one of my favorite dark romance books of the year. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It just hit all the tropes that you want out of a book like that, and I was not disappointed. I read another physical book that I ended up giving away called Before I Let Go. Before I Let Go is about a girl who goes to Alaska because her friend, the assumption is that she committed suicide. It's a very sad and very psychologically messed up book. I know that's the point of the book, is to not give you a good vibe. Like, it's teaching you these things about trauma and about culture, but I just did not have fun reading it. I gave it 3.5 stars because it is a good read and it is important, the topics that it's covering, but it was not fun. I followed that up with yet another dark romance called The Dare. This book really speaks for itself with the cover here. It's a very dark romance, but it's very short too. It's all about just one night between this guy and this girl. I gave it 3 stars. It wasn't the best writing, and it honestly, I get the entertainment value, but it didn't have a plot. It really was just for the entertainment of the night that this guy and this girl have. Do with that what you will. I was getting myself a little burnt out on a dark romance at this point, thank God. So I actually went through classics that I have, but I just haven't read yet, that I really have been wanting to read. Starting with Ocean at the End of the Lane. All I have is a mass market paper copy of this, which is really a bummer because it ended up being a pretty good book. I only gave it 3 stars only because I feel like the ending could have been better, and I also, hey kitty, the things that happen just feel a little weird. I don't know. I had trouble getting into it. I also read Second First Impressions, which is another, not debut author, but she's pretty new. It's a romance book, but it's not a dark romance, and the love interest is very golden retriever-ish. Yeah, so I gave Second First Impressions 3 stars. It's not even that the writing was bad, it's just that the authors, I don't know, the characters felt a little immature, and I didn't like the guy, and if you don't like the guy in a romance book, it's really hard to get into the romance book. I then went back to my nonfiction pile and picked up Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey. I didn't realize that I liked this actor as much as I liked him, and I read pieces of this book twice because they just hit me so, they were so impactful, and now I adore this actor. And want to find every movie he's in and want to find every interview he has, and I follow him on all social media. I want to be able to sit down and have coffee with him and pick his brain, because I just had no idea the kind of profound, like, existential things that he discusses in this book that I even struggle with. And I didn't even realize that, like, I couldn't put it into words the way he was putting them into words. And I just could not stop recommending this book. I gave it 5 stars. I think I'm going to read it again this year. I then read Own Your Past, Change Your Future by John Deloney. I gave it 4 stars because some of it felt dragged out. As I said earlier, with nonfiction books, it happens. But the main point of this book, I feel like everyone needs to read this to understand your own mental health and your mental health journey. I actually then read The Atlas Six. I wanted to find out what the hype was about. The hype is very appropriate. Probably my #1 fantasy read of the year, if not just overall ever. There were several chapters in this guy that I read multiple times only because her writing is so unusual. It's almost poetic. Like, the way the characters think, they're so pretentious, and they also are all kind of in love with each other, but they also all hate each other. It's just so enticing. It's dark academia. There's 6 people, but only 5 are supposed to make it out of the program. So character driven. And there's not a single character that I dislike. They're all kind of messed up, but all in their own ways, and I love them all for it. While I was reading that book, I was also reading The Never King, a Peter Pan dark romance retelling on Kindle Unlimited. I don't recommend it. I gave it 3 stars, but it was really weird and disturbing for no reason whatsoever. But I mean, if you want the entertainment value is there for sure. I'm so excited about my next read of the year because I went and finally read the entire Court of Thorns and Roses series. I only owned these 2 guys when I started it, and as soon as I got to the end of book 1, I went ahead and bought the other 3. Like, there's a lot of books on Book Talk that are overhyped, and A Court of Thorns and Roses I assumed was one of them. And to be fair, the first book, yeah, a little bit overhyped. The first book is kind of a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, but with a twist at the end. The twist at the end, the last 100 pages, I was literally unable to put the book down. But up until the last 100 pages, I was kind of like, this is very YA. But then when I went on to book 2, this was a 5+ star read. If I could give it more than 5 stars, I would. The romance is beautiful. I adore Rhysand. I adore the Bat Boys. I adore every single character in this book, even the ones that we're supposed to hate. I just could not get enough of it. I'm actually rereading it this year. Favorite book in the series. You can see by the amount of tabs I have in it. And the fact that I went through after I read this book and bought cooler covers. I adore them. But yeah, so basically I paid for the books twice. Obviously followed that one up by reading A Court of Wings and Ruin, the little Christmas special, as we like to call it, A Court of Frost and Starlight. There's a lot of debate over whether this book is worth reading or not. I think it is. I think they needed this little cute break between all the war and bloodshed and people dying. I think it's adorable. But then the plot really picks back up in A Court of Silver Flames. This one, if it wasn't for Mist and Fury, this one would be my favorite in the series, because I never before have gone into a book hating a character so much and come out of the book loving a character so much. Like, Nesta is one of my favorite characters now. I just want to read the chapter where Nesta really, I won't give away too much, but where Nesta really has like her breakdown and like the moment when Cassian is holding her through it. I just, in that moment, realized that I am Nesta in so many ways, and I didn't even realize it, and maybe that's why I hated her so much. I could rant about this book for days. Maybe I'll make a separate video just for ACOTAR. Obviously a 5-star read. I went back and picked up some of my classics pile after that series, starting with The Little Prince. It's supposed to be the inside a kid's mind, basically, and it's the same deal I had with Ocean at the End of the Lane. I get the idea, I get it. It was just not a super fun read. I think I gave it 2.5 stars. I then read A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. I've never read a Hemingway book before, but I hear people all the time talk about him, and they usually seem to hate his writing. I loved this writing. I gave the book 4 out of 5 stars. I thought the writing style was really cool. It's very train of thought, unlikable characters, but you end up liking them. The ending had me in tears. I then read through an entire book of poetry by Robert Frost. Robert Frost is the only poet of which I can read his poetry for hours on end. Like most poetry, I'm like, I can read one or two, I'm about done. Robert Frost has a way of you just sinking into it. It's not all like the Birches or any of the ones that we had to read in high school. A lot of it is deeper than that and more profound. 4 stars. Finishing off the classics pile, I read Animal Farm and 1984 by George Orwell. I gave Animal Farm 4 stars, I gave 1984 5 stars. They are touching on a very similar topic, but in different ways. Animal Farm was a much quicker read. This one, however, is very heartbreaking and traumatizing. I thought that it had gotten as bad as it could get by the end of the book, but then it gets worse. And I still think about it on a regular basis, which means it's a good book. And it's terrifyingly similar to themes that are going on in our own culture and society today. Terrifying that he could predict that kind of stuff. But on a more positive note, I picked up a fantasy series that I've been wanting to read forever, and I've had all the books forever, but not until I read ACOTAR did I think that I really needed to pick them up. Throne of Glass, starting with Assassin's Blade. This is going to create so much debate, I just know it. People have a lot of opinions on whether you should read Assassin's Blade first or whether you should read it after the 3rd book. Personally, it hits a lot different when you read it first. The ending, the character that has the thing happen at the end, I can't say because I'll spoil it, was so unexpected and traumatizing. But that made it all that much better. I was instantly hooked. That way, I could get through Sarah J. Maas's first 2 books she ever wrote, Throne of Glass and Crown of Midnight, without giving up. Because I think if I had read these first, I probably would have quit. Because her writing is just not as good. And I get that because she was 16 when she wrote the first one, and there's a lot of things that could have gone into why these are so different than the rest of the series, but they're just not as good. The characters are not as developed, they're not as intelligent. They're supposed to all be 18 to 20, but they act like 14-year-olds sometimes. I gave them both 4 stars because the story is really cool, and I wanted to keep reading because of that. But the writing style and the characters killed me in these 2. But I gave Assassin's Blade 5 stars, and that gave me hope that the series gets better. And it does. Heir of Fire is the turning point in this series because it's so good and the romance is so good. She finds the exact person for her, and you can see that from the beginning. And everything gets to the ACOTAR level of good in Queen of Shadows. I gave this book 5 stars. The whole thing upset me, but the ending especially just really turned it all around. It was amazing. Take Empire of Storms, on the other hand, the whole thing was really fun to read until the end. And the end really upsets you. 10 out of 10, writing, story, characters, everything. You take a detour in Tower of Dawn to learn more about Chaol, which I wasn't mad about. A lot of people were mad about this. I wasn't mad about it because I adore Chaol. Even before his redemption arc, I adored Chaol because he's just being a human. He's one of the only humans there. And he's just trying to be a good guy and do what he thinks is best. And he keeps messing up. I loved him from the beginning. This book just made me love him even more and love Irene. This actually was my 2nd favorite book in the whole series. And people are going to be on me for that. But I just loved the arc here. It was a lot like Nessa's arc in A Court of Silver Flames. Very similar characters. Finishes with a bang in Kingdom of Ash. The entire book, I barely did anything else when I was reading this book because I just had to know what happened next. So much war. It's not like A Court of Wings and Ruin where there's a big battle and it's done. There are so many big battles, which makes more sense for a war of this type. So much is on the line, and you really believe that everyone is going to die at some point or another, especially the main characters, because there's just no way out. I won't say whether they do or not, but I highly recommend this book. This is my favorite book in this series. I'm going to follow that up with a shameless plug because I read it enough times in the editing phases this year that I'm going to count it as one read. Desolation Born by Elias Simone. It's in a fantasy world, but the setting is based off of Native American culture pre-colonial era. Her tribe has been at war with the tribe across the river for generations. She's not entirely sure why. She's also not entirely sure what her purpose is in the tribe or in the world, really. And it's kind of a coming-of-age story, but also with fantasy elements and Hunger Games vibes, mixed with Throne of Glass vibes. She figures out that she has powers that she didn't know that she had. No one in her tribe knew that powers existed in this world until she discovers hers. So it's a really cool magical realism turned fantasy. I highly recommend it. link in my bio and in the description of this video to order this book on Amazon. I followed that up with a reread of the Atlas 6 in preparation for the Atlas Paradox coming out. Not as exciting as the Atlas 6. I've seen this happen in other trilogies where it could have been a duology, but because the author has decided to make a trilogy, or possibly because the author got a 3-book deal and is required to do a trilogy, the second book kind of drags. That's kind of what this felt like. It's not that I lost faith in any of the characters or that the story or plot wasn't cool, but it felt like it could have been wrapped up sooner. This felt like we were introduced to a lot of problems that didn't even need to happen, and the main problem that we've known since the first book now needs an entire other book to get that wrapped up. I still give it 4 stars. I still highly recommend both books. I'm just hoping the third book fixes some of the things that we know need to be resolved. My last nonfiction of the year was Kisses from Katie. It's about this woman who goes to Uganda. She ends up adopting, I think, something like 18 kids of her own, a lot of kids of her own, and just her story and the kind of things that she saw in that country, that there's no way that she can fix the whole country, but she can fix it one child at a time, and it's really precious and so inspiring. I gave it 4 stars. I really think everyone needs to read this book though. I then read Tokyo Ever After, which is a YA romance book. I gave it 3.5 stars because it reads so YA. It, like, the text messages that she and her friends send each other, the way that she reacts to some of the things that happen, some of the pieces of romance in it are so cringy. However, the reason it got up to 3.5 is because it has the enemies to lovers trope in it. It has the bodyguard trope in it, and it does those tropes really well. My last read of the year was actually one of my favorites, Fable by Adrienne Young. This is a duology. The second book is called Namesake, and it completes her face. Just like A Thousand Pieces of You trilogy, I bought it because it looks really cool on my shelf, and then it turned out the story was just as good. The main character is such a badass. I could not get enough of her. I wish there were more books of her. I thought there was because the author had come out with other books, but they're about other characters. So you just get the duology of her, but it is so worth it. A must read if you haven't read it yet. That is all 50 books I read in 2022 and their ratings. As a recap, my favorites were all of the Sarah J. Maas books, embarrassingly so because I thought they were overhyped. Fable, A Thousand Pieces of You, and Desolation Born by me. This is an ARC copy, as you can tell. Copy you'll get will be even prettier. I hope you enjoyed hearing about all of my fun reads this year. I'm doing weekly book reviews in 2023, so you can keep up with it as I go instead of having to wait till the end of the year or the month. I'll still be coming out with longer form videos. I have so many cool life updates for you guys as well. I cannot wait to talk about those. But until then, I will talk to you guys next week. Have a great week.